Good evening. I'm Henry Stewart. I'm co-head of the global energy sector at Watson, Farley and Williams. Welcome to the final event in our Energy Insights webinar series. After extremely interesting discussions with Dieter Helm and Fiona Wolf, we are delighted to be speaking this evening with Lord Deben. Before we get started, a few housekeeping notes. First of all, please note that your video and audio has been disabled. Second, please note that if you'd like to pose a question to Lord Deben, please use the Q&A function at any time during the presentation. And finally, please note that this webinar will be recorded. Now to introduce our esteemed guest. Lord Deben is currently Chairman of the Committee on Climate Change and was the longest serving UK Secretary of State for the Environment. He set up and now runs Sancroft, a corporate responsibility consultancy working with blue chip companies around the world on environmental, social and ethical issues. Speaking with Lord Deben today is Marianne Anton. Marianne Anton is a senior associate in the London energy team at Watson Farley, and she runs our energy regulatory practice. Marianne trained at another city firm and has also spent 4 years at Offshore. She's passionate about the renewable power industry and is keen to help clients navigate around regulatory challenges to complete successful projects. Over to you, Marianne.
Thank you, Henry, and thank you, Lord Deben, for joining us. We're delighted to have you with us this evening. I think we're just going to dive right in. Our time is limited and we have lots to talk about. So I'm going to start with the Climate Change Committee's progress report, which was published earlier this year. It highlighted an opportunity to build a resilient recovery from the COVID-19 crisis. Can you tell us a little bit about what that might look like?
Well, I will, but just let me warn you that if there's a great bell in a moment, it's just that I'm voting in the House of Lords, and we do it by remote control now. So if you hear this noise, just ignore it and I'll do something about it. But there we are. Well, our determination was to look at what COVID would mean to our economy and ask ourselves very bluntly and toughly the question, did that make a difference to what our advice was as far as the economy had been in a pre-COVID situation? And the answer was no. In fact, it really was rather more than that. It said that there was no other way of developing a new economy after COVID, except in the direction which we had already said was necessary in order to combat climate change. So it's not a question of kind of using COVID as a mechanism of getting our own way on climate change, which sometimes people suggest. It's something quite different. It is that if we don't do it this way, there really will be no recovery, because what COVID has taught us is just how huge are the risks, how universal are the effects of those risks, and how vital it is that we understand that this is a world issue and we have to build an economy which is sustainable. That means sustainable not only in terms of the United Kingdom or the European Union or the United States of America, but sustainable in terms of our long-term relationships with all the rest of the world, both in terms of supply chain and in terms of our customers.
Building on that theme about it being a global issue that everybody needs to work together to address, I know that we are, the Climate Change Committee is due to publish its recommendations on the 6th carbon budget in December to cover the period from 2033 to 2037. And there are two questions I have about this. And the first one is, because this is the first carbon budget to be set after our net zero target has been enshrined in law, is this budget going to be more difficult to set? And the second related question is, do you think that we will be revisiting earlier carbon budgets to reflect the new target, particularly because the 6th the sixth budget doesn't come into effect until 2033?
Well, of course, the budgets are purposely set that far ahead because you must enable both government organisations and above all business to know the direction and detail of where we are going to be. Now, as you know, these budgets are presented by the Climate Change Committee. They are then presented to be voted on in the Houses of Parliament. And if they are accepted, and all 5 previous ones have been, they become the law. Government has to meet them. But they also can't be changed without the agreement of the Climate Change Committee. So it's, and we're not giving that agreement, let me be quite clear. Now, when we did the work we were asked to do by the government, which was to see how did we meet the Paris Agreement that we'd made. Could we reach net zero? And if so, could we do it? By when could we do it? And what would it cost us? Well, when we did that, of course, we were also asked, we've been asked before that separately, was did it fit in? Did the Paris Agreement fit in with the budgets we'd already done? And if you think about a budget, it's really is a sort of, there's a sort of triangular thing. You can get to this level at the bottom or that level at the top. Now, roughly speaking, what we have to do is to get to the top level in order to be in the proper trajectory for the 6 carbon budget. But there's no doubt that, of course, it's always true that each new budget is more difficult than previous ones because it's the low-hanging fruit that you first deal with. And there'll be no doubt that the 6 carbon budget will not be easy, but it will be possible, it will be practical, and it will, of course, be able to be done within the financial window, which we have already said, which is between 0.5% and 2% of the GNP. My own view is that it will be lower than the top of that, because what happens is that when you start to do these things with enthusiasm, of course, prices fall. I mean, just look at the cost of offshore wind. I mean, when I was running an offshore wind company before I became chairman of the Climate Change Committee, we were talking about a unit of that we were talking about would cost 200. It's now 49 or 46. I mean, we're right down there. This has all happened in a matter of 6 years. It's the most amazing change. So there is no doubt that I think that if we put our hearts into it and our backs into it, we'll end up with a price which is not only one we can afford, but will be less than we expect.
It is a phenomenal change, and it's great that you highlight that. I myself worked in offshore transmission at Ofgem many years ago, and it's extraordinary to see the price fall. Nobody expected it to fall that quickly.
We didn't believe it. I mean, we were the very ones who didn't think it was possible. It's a remarkable thing.
Right, and just changing direction for a moment. At the start of this lecture series, we spoke to Dieter Helm about his new book, Net Zero. I don't know if you've had a chance to read it yet, but in it he criticizes emissions accounting on a territorial basis, and he posits that consumption accounting would be more effective in reducing overall emissions. Do you agree with that assessment?
Well, no, because it doesn't accord with the realities of life. The truth is that the reason we account in both ways is because both sorts of accounting, they're not contradictory, but they both have different roles. The accounting that we have of emissions is because those are the things over which we have control. The government and business in Britain has control over its emissions. The Climate Change Committee can recommend how you reduce those emissions finally to net zero. We don't have control over consumption emissions because the fact is we don't know very often how truthful are the emissions figures which are given by people abroad. So that's the first reason. The second reason why it seems to me not to be a sensible argument to have is that every country in the world has to deal with its emissions, its own emissions, because otherwise you can't commit yourself to reducing those. And you'd have double counting if you were dealing with consumption emissions. What Dieter has got right, I think, and perfectly reasonably, is that you can't stop with those emissions. You have to move on constantly to remind people of consumption emissions. And that is exactly what the Climate Change Committee does, which is that on a regular basis, we look at the consumption emissions for two reasons. One is to see that we do not drive emissions out of this country into places where it is easier to emit, which of course would be totally without any sense. I mean, that would not be sensible. And so there's a reason to make sure that you don't have that leakage. But the second reason is that we really do have to remind people, and indeed insist upon people, thinking seriously about those emissions which are not accounted for in this country, but which are accounted for elsewhere, so that when they're making their decisions about lifestyle, for example, it's no good saying, well, I'm not buying anything in Britain because that reduces our emissions. One has to think very seriously about the impact of the emissions which are created by our decisions to buy things and services which come from abroad. So it's a question, as I think always in life, it's both and not either or.
I think that is a very fair and diplomatic way of putting it. But while we are on the subject of carbon consumption, is there, I mean, in your view, what is there that we should be doing at a government policy level, but also at a personal sort of individual level when we think about our own carbon consumption?
Well, first of all, I'm not a Puritan. I think it's terribly important not to say to people, you've all got to wear woolly jumpers and open-toed sandals and be cold and be miserable. This is not a recipe for misery. There are two reasons for that. One is that I don't think it's true. The second is that if we went around like that, we'd never win. If you remember in the Puritan days, praise God, bare bones lost in the end, because people wanted Christmas and their mince pies. What we have to do is to be able to have Christmas and mince pies, but to have it not at the cost of the planet. So that's the first thing, is let's not be miserable about it, because otherwise we won't win. We have to be...
We won't live longer, it will just feel that way.
Well, that is absolutely true. So I'm very keen on... So the first thing is, let's look at it in that way. Then you have to say to yourself, but there are lifestyle choices which you should be making. So for example, we say that we should be eating less and better meat. 20% cut in meat makes a very big difference to the emissions, but we ought to be eating meat which is from animals which are pastured and not which are fed by the mechanisms which are particularly prevalent in the United States. That's why I've been very, very tough about trying to get the government to accept the fact that our standards of animal welfare, our standards of food safety, our standards of environment really do have to be maintained in any negotiated free trade arrangement, because we cannot have a situation in which people who stuff animals filled with corn, which is not A, good for them, and B, certainly not good for the meat, can then dump that meat in Britain. And because they can do it so much more cheaply than doing it properly, then we really would have consumption figures about which Dieter Helm would properly complain. So I think the answer is that, first of all, we should know about what we do. There are lots of ways in which we can reduce our impact on the planet, many of them terribly simple. I mean, why on earth we boil a whole kettle of water in order to have one cup of coffee if you have instant coffee? I mean, it's just beyond me. So you do very simple things like that. It makes a huge difference. And then the other thing that you do, I do think, is to ask yourself questions about whether certain things are really either necessary or joyful. I mean, I really do think that we can put ice cubes into the fridge and we don't need to have an ice maker, for example. It's a very simple thing, because it's only that I have to remember to put the ice cubes in the fridge. That's the only reason I should want to have an ice cube maker. I mean, do you see what I mean? It's a question of being more sensible about what we do, but being joyous about it. I don't want us to be any less hospitable, and I don't want not to have ice in my drink.
Brilliant. Well, you mentioned some trade in passing, but I think Brexit is a whole nother topic that we will not be getting onto today. You might be happy to hear. We'll move on to something else that the Prime Minister has been speaking about recently. He spoke at the Conservative Party conference 2 weeks ago, and he focused heavily in that speech on expanding offshore wind capability through investing in developing the next generation turbines and floating turbines. Do you think that the plans he set out are ambitious enough to deliver another 30 gigawatts of offshore wind by 2030?
Well, I can't disagree with it, because it's the recommendation of the Climate Change Committee, so I should look rather odd if I were doing that. No, I think the ambition up to 2030 is certainly what we need. It's a very tough thing to do, to deliver this. I thought it particularly valuable that he should have said that he was also putting 160 odd million pounds aside for improving our ports, because we don't really have the facilities for the much bigger turbines which we are now going to be able to use. But the thing that was missing, and the thing that really is worrying on that front, is that it isn't just about generation, it's about two other things. First of all, it's about distribution. And frankly, we have a ridiculously backward redistribution system, and we're not going to be able to do these things unless we do something about that. I mean, if we're really going to have an all-electric car sales system by the time we get to 2030, then these electric cars have also got to be able to feed back into the grid as well as taking out of the grid. Now, if you live where I live, I know perfectly well that's not going to happen, because the links are not good enough. So there has to be a very major change in the amount of money we spend and the mechanisms we use for the connection between offshore and onshore. That at the moment is a ridiculously silly system, which is based upon 20 years ago view of competition. We really can't have people all bringing their offshore wind onshore at different places and destroying our villages in order to do that. There's no point in putting it offshore if you're then going to make things ugly onshore. So what we have to do is to have a proper ring main and reorganize that, and the government has got to change the rules, and Ofgem has got to insist upon a different way of doing it. So that's the one thing I was sorry not to hear about. The other thing is we can do so much more by energy efficiency. And what we really need to have is an urgent change in the way in which we help people to be more efficient. And the government has promised that. The government has said this is going to happen. A number of things they've already done, but it is still not enough. It is not simple enough for people to understand. It really has to be a very simple thing to do. And more important than anything is we must stop building houses that we're going to have to retrofit. Do you know, we've built 1 million houses since we pointed this out to the government, 1 million houses since the government was stupid enough to get rid of their zero carbon commitment, that have got to be refitted and retrofitted. What a nonsense that is. 1 million houses. And everybody who bought one of those houses has been given a bill by the house builder because their energy costs are going to be much higher than they need be if the house that had been built was not a crap house. And we really do have to say that to the house builders, whom I think have let Britain down really seriously.
Well, that sounds like a call to arms, and I have to say I'm very pleased, reassured to hear some of your thoughts on the offshore transmission regime and all of those radial connections, because that is the specific area that I worked in when I was at Ofgem. And of course, the intention was always to have an offshore network, and it hasn't come about that way. But there is work ongoing, so maybe we'll see that soon. The other thing that we've seen before and was revived in March's budget, which the Prime Minister also mentioned a few weeks ago, is carbon capture and storage. I guess my question to you is, what is different about CCS this time around? What is it that can give us faith or confidence that it will actually be carried through instead of abandoned as it was last time?
Well, I do think we have a government which is committed. I mean, my job is to keep its feet to the fire, and obviously I spend much of my time saying we need to have it now and urgently, because actually urgency is the big issue. And I do think that if there's a criticism, and it is a very big criticism, there's rather too much word and too little actually delivery. But my own view is that they really understand now that carbon capture and storage is an essential part of the commitment to getting to net zero. There's no way we can do that without some carbon capture and storage and perhaps usage. I think that the way that they are doing it is the right way. I mean, I think it is about industrial clusters. I think that is where we ought to be doing it. It happens to fit in with any sensible regional policy too, because it will provide jobs in areas where the jobs which were in the oil and gas industry will disappear. So, I mean, I can see all that as being really very sensible. I just think we have to keep them down to it. I mean, I don't think they're going to renege on it, but I think we have to keep them down to it, because urgency is so important, not just because climate change is happening and happening really seriously and fast, but that every year you leave it, the more expensive it is, and the more climate change you've allowed to happen, and therefore the bigger is the problem. So urgency becomes the key to doing this in a cost-effective way.
And I guess part of that, the CCS picture, is hydrogen, which also featured in the Prime Minister's speech. Yes. It has been a really hot topic. I think a lot of industry players are looking to make the most of the wind resources that we have, and the existing infrastructure. You mentioned already some of the oil and gas infrastructure and the oil and gas jobs at the moment. So, you know, there is certainly an impetus to take advantage of some of that by deploying some green hydrogen solutions. Again, I have two questions in this area. And the first,
I can do it without. I know what I want to do. Okay, right. You can.
Is that your bell?
It's all right. Don't worry.
Carry on. The first question was, when or how soon do you see green hydrogen actually playing a large part in our energy mix? And the second is sort of a broader, what are your views on sort of green hydrogen generally?
Let me come back to that. You'll have to say that again, because I missed that last part. Thank you.
Okay.
So let's do it again. Thank you.
So the last part was just your general views on hydrogen and whether you think it's going to be.
Well, I have two views about hydrogen. First of all, it is clearly going to, I think, is likely to be part of the future, but it is at the moment not part of the future, because we haven't got a way of doing it which is not very expensive both in energy and resources. So we've got to break that. We've got to deal with that. So that's my first point. My second point is that I'm worried that it becomes a kind of silver bullet. If we're not careful, people say, "Oh well, you know, we'll have the hydrogen economy." Well, yeah, but we're not there. And if it's the way in which you don't do other things, it seems to me that is really dangerous, and it's that concerns me. I don't think that we help ourselves if we don't recognise that. Unfortunately, politicians are particularly good at looking for some, if you like, silver bullet. There aren't silver bullets here. It's almost always, as I suggested when we talked about Dieter Helm, it's usually both and. And the reason we need to work on hydrogen as well as carbon capture and storage and battery development and all the rest of it is we don't know is the first thing. And the second thing is that it's extremely likely that we'll need it all. And therefore we better get on with it. And it may be that we can't do at scale what we hope we'll be able to do with hydrogen. So I'm very much in favour of what Northern Gas is doing in the north, dealing with the hydrogen, seeing whether we could put it into the gas mains, because obviously that would be a valuable use of something we've already got. But it is very expensive, and we don't know whether we could, and it needs an awful lot of adaptation, the things we use, all kinds of things we've got to know. So we have to do it all, but we have not to lead people astray by suggesting that we only have to do that and we'll all be all right. And I'm just don't want that to get into the whole concept. So very good for hydrogen, but it's not necessarily the answer, and it's certainly not a silver bullet.
A cautionary note, which is good to hear at times. And now this is the next question is the question I have been itching to ask since we started, which is about the energy white paper, which has been promised and eagerly awaited since summer of 2019. We keep being told it's coming, it's coming. Will we be seeing it this year? Do you have any?
I have no sort of either mystic powers or knowledge of any more than you do. I mean, we have been promised it, and we constantly promised it, and they keep on telling us it's going to be sooner. But then this is a history of white papers, energy white papers. I mean, remember Mr. Blair's government. I mean, we went on and on and on and on waiting for an energy white paper, and we only got it in the end because they removed all the dates on it except 2050, so that nobody could be held to it if they didn't do it. Well, I mean, I think it will come relatively soon, because all the other things they want to do depend upon fitting into it. So I think that's true. And I think the thing we'll have to see is whether this is a practical policy for action, or whether it is not, whether it is merely another statement of a whole series of hopes. I don't think it will be. And certainly we'll be looking in the Climate Change Committee for a white paper which is very clear on what the government is going to do and sets out proper timetables for doing it. Unless we have that, then there's no point. I mean, we cannot go on with good intentions. We know where that road goes, and it certainly is going there if we don't do what we need to do now. And as I say, I'm complimentary about the government's statements. I'm pleased about what it has already done. We have been very pleased with its response to our criticism. But I just have to say, every day it has to be done, and done urgently.
I'm starting to feel a little bit toasty already. I think another thing that we were expecting to happen, certainly in the next few weeks, is COP26, and that has been delayed by about a year. It's happening sometime next year. With COP26 coming, and being, I think, co-hosted now by the UK. There's a co-presidency, I believe, this time. What do you see as the key priorities for the government to deliver before then, so that we are seen as credible and committed?
Well, the first thing is, of course, Britain has got to show that it is actually leading the way. So we have to deliver a lot of action between now and then. We've also got to deliver commitments, because part of what we do is the commitments for future action. I hope we'll be able to deliver the sixth carbon budget. That will depend. I mean, the government will have to make its mind up as to that, but we will deliver it to the government by December. And of course, this is a whole year before. But if we have the sixth carbon budget, we've committed ourselves to that, and then we've actually committed ourselves to leading the world in those commitments, then that's going to be very important. We are much helped by the fact that China has made some really remarkable promises. We'll want to put some skin on those bones and work with the Chinese. I know we're not going to talk about the European Union. We have made it, of course, very much more difficult for ourselves by the stupidity of leaving the European Union. And nothing is going to stop me saying that, because it is really essential. We were the leaders in the European Union. We have now put ourselves in a position in which we cannot influence in the same way. And that is wrong, and we shouldn't have done it. But we have done it, so we're going to have to work harder to overcome that. And it would be helpful, I think, if we were a bit more polite to our neighbours, because we want them to help us as well. So let's realise that. But it's the first test, of course, of the government's belief in Britain's global role. So we've got to get it right. And the people who've got to get it right most are those who think that our global role is easier now outside the European Union. Well, I don't think it is. I think it's more difficult. But I'm very happy to cheer them on if they prove me wrong. Indeed, I want them to prove me wrong, and I should do everything that I can to help them prove me wrong.
Well, I must say I do agree with some of those sentiments that you expressed, but I think we must move swiftly on before we get derailed. We have some questions that we've been asking all of our guests, and I think there's one in particular that we haven't really touched on yet, so I've left us a little bit more time for that. But the first question is, if you could have a conversation with anybody in history, who would it be and why?
Oh, what a wonderful question! And no doubt we have to leave out the Bible and the usual thing that you do on. So it's not going to be Jesus Christ. If I could have, I think I would. There are two people, one religious and one secular. I would love to spend a very long time talking to Cardinal Newman, who is my hero and who I think intellectually, right across the board, from everything from the university to an understanding of the natural order, would be. He'd be a very tight fight between him and the great poet Gerard Manley Hopkins, who again has a fantastic statement about the natural world and the amazing gift that we have of this, the variety and the beauty and the overwhelming, bubbling amount of fecundity of the natural world, which we have been so outrageous in destroying to such a large extent. So I know I would like to talk to him. And if I wanted just to say thank you to somebody, it would be to talk to Rachel Carson, who wrote The Silent Spring, and one would like to say to her just simply thank you, because you started what we are now carrying through, and you started it nearly 60 years ago, so it is a remarkable fact.
Brilliant. it's been fascinating hearing different answers to that question. So thank you for sharing that with us. Our second question is, as we are speaking about energy, what gives you your energy?
Luck. I mean, fortune, blessing. I mean, I'm just very lucky to be to have a great deal of energy. So I don't know what gives it to me. I eat a lot. I am a great believer in God's gift of the vine and the products of the vine. I'm lucky enough to be married to somebody who wouldn't allow me to be other than energetic.
And finally, and this is perhaps a bigger question that covers what we've been discussing. What does the energy industry look like in 2050?
Well, I think it will have some very disappointed relics of people who haven't understood what they should do. I think that the museums will have the word ESSO as a memorial to a company that has died because it pretended that climate change hadn't happened. Indeed, was appalling enough to spend money trying to convince other people of that, and it's behind everybody else in changing its attitudes. And it'll have some heroes. I mean, there will be the Repsols of this world who have actually led the way. And there will be people who have turned great companies like BP and Shell into companies that have increasingly understood what they have to do in order to make this big transference from where we are to there. So I think we'll have that. Secondly, we will have some of the newcomers will be seen as old established firms, I suspect. I think we would also have a situation in which we don't have the division between energy and the rest of industry. It seems to me that what is happening is that all these things are coming together. And if you think about it, we'll all be in the energy industry because we'll all be contributing something to it, either just through our vehicles, as I talked about earlier on, or because we've got things on our roof, or we're doing all sorts of things. So the whole of the energy industry, which has always been a sort of great big industry apart, and I always think that the French word for a le général, sort of great big thing here. The fact is that it won't be like that. It'll be very much more mixed. It'll be very much more widespread. It will be really exciting. And it will go into every corner of life. And that's what it should be. We will be in that kind of world. And we'll wonder so hard why we didn't do it earlier. That's the thing that will happen. And we will be ashamed, actually, of the amount that we've damaged our world because we were not prepared to move from cheap and damaging energy to cheap and invigorating energy.
It's a good vision to have. So thank you for sharing that. We do have a few questions that have come in from our audience, and I'm just going to, I'm conscious of time. We have a few minutes left, so we'll get through what we can. There are two questions that have come in from one of our attendees about, one is what will onshore wind's role be in helping the UK achieve its targets? And the second is, will natural carbon sequestration, such as peatland and woodland restoration, have a value in future carbon budgets?
Well, two things really. The first thing is that let me just take the sequestration thing. I mean, I don't think it's just woodland. I think it is that we're going to have a different land use. We're going to have to reinvigorate our soils so that we get the sort of the kind of sequestration which only fertile soils can do, that's going to be a very important part. We're going to have to reinvigorate our oceans too. There is no doubt that the ocean is able to sequestrate a great deal of carbon if you don't have bottom trolling trawlers, which is why I'm very pleased with what Greenpeace did, was to make that really very difficult on the Dogger Bank and such like, really to make people understand that we can't do that. And actually our offshore areas are really very much more easily, we will be able to do that. Just on the offshore Britain, we could do a great deal of sequestration, encouragement of kelp and other things like that. So there's a lot of that can be done in that sequestration area. Now, as far as onshore wind is concerned, I'm a believer in onshore wind. I think it was quite wrong to stop it by using technical mechanisms whereby the onshore wind wasn't able to be used. I was very critical of government about that. I'm pleased that we're now beyond that. I'm pleased that we're now in a situation in which we're not going to find that an issue. It is the cheapest form of generation, and I've always thought that if government wanted to stop it, do they really want to have told the public how much more it costs to get to net zero if you don't have onshore wind? You know, you've got to be truthful. There is a price to pay. Communities who want to have onshore wind, and there are many of them, should be allowed to have them, and we should encourage it. We've got some onshore wind near us here in Suffolk. There were lots of people who didn't want to have it, but we have got it, and actually it's now contributing to the skyline. It's actually made lots of people who were opposed to it originally, they're rather keen on it now. These are great windmills which say something to us about our lives, which I think is worthwhile. But I don't want to force it on people. I think where they want to have it, they should be having it, and I think we should encourage it. We should try to get the argument out there as to why it's important. You obviously don't want to have it in a way which destroys the beauty of particular parts of the countryside. There's a balance to be had there, but I think it will play a big part.
Of course. We've had another question going back to networks and network
Yes.
reinforcement that we spoke about earlier. We've had a comment that some people regarded the Rio model of pricing to be a very good system to deliver innovation. And the question is, how do you feel about the new system, which seems to focus a lot less on innovation-driven shared savings?
I didn't hear the last part of that. Can you say focus on
Yes,
innovation?
it's, how do you feel about the new system that focuses less on innovation and driving shared savings through innovation?
Well, you know, I am a both and person. I come back to that. You know, I think if we don't drive innovation in the way that we were doing so far, we have to do it in a different way. So, I mean, again, I don't think I want to make a distinction between it. I think I want to say we need to achieve both these. And our biggest problem is actually not in that area as far as innovation is concerned. Our biggest problem is how we not only innovate, but that we commercialize the innovation that we have. And you know that from your own experience in Offshore. There is a real problem, particularly in this country, but elsewhere too. And that's the area I'd like to concentrate on.
Brilliant. And we do have one last question, and we're grateful to you for bearing with us. We're going to go over by a couple of minutes. The final question we've had is about the hydrogen strategy, and the EU and Germany and others have recently been publishing hydrogen strategies, and they've sort of published views on a hydrogen economy. And the question here is, what is your view on developing a UK-wide hydrogen strategy, and what are the barriers to achieving that?
Well, first of all, the Climate Change Committee has asked for that, and I think it's important for national reasons too, because as the likelihood is, as long as you don't think of it as a silver bullet, the likelihood is that hydrogen will play an important part in our future, then I want Britain to be there producing some of the key elements of that. And if we don't have a proper strategy, then those who do will. And historically, of course, we would have been part of the European Union strategy, which was a point I made earlier. We're not. One of the things we have to learn is that if we're not, we have to do all these things ourselves. And we don't have the capability often of doing that. I don't mean that we can't do it because we're stupid or something. What I mean is that we don't have the structural capability in this. So we are a nation which has always had difficulty in dealing with these structurally. And the European Union has been very valuable to us in enabling us to do things which we wouldn't otherwise have been able to do very easily ourselves. As we have been led by those who decide that we will be better not in the European Union, frankly, they've got to answer that question too. They've got to show us that we will have a structure for dealing with these matters which is effective. And I'm not sure that I've seen much of that so far. I mean, if you have criticism of the government, it might be that the long-termism is not noticeable, and therefore, apart from their, I think, very good long-termism as far as green issues are concerned, on these practical businesses of delivering things like the hydrogen strategy, I'm not sure that we've really got the structure that we need. So I'm rather boringly saying we have to look at the way that Britain handles these big issues. We have now decided that we want to handle them on our own. Well, okay, but you've got to have a system and a mechanism to do that.
Well, you've certainly given us a lot to think about. Thank you so much for spending the time with us. It was a wide-ranging discussion. We covered a lot of ground. So you have my thanks, and I will hand back over to Henry for some final housekeeping points.
Thank you very much, Lord Deben, and thank you, Marianne, for a very insightful and entertaining discussion. And thank you to the audience for dialing in. The audience will be receiving an email tomorrow which contains a feedback survey. We'd be very grateful if you'd fill out that survey. And finally, please note that if you missed either of the first two in our Insight series, those will be available for viewing online in due course, and we'll send you information around that shortly. But good evening and thank you again.
Thank you.
Thank you.